When a mud-covered woman stepped into a small-town diner, people whispered, judged, and turned their backs. But the single dad waiting for her noticed something everyone else ignored. A police report band on her wrist from only hours earlier. She wasn't dirty. She wasn't unstable. She was running from someone powerful. And what she saw the night before could change the entire town. Caleb Winslow had walked into the diner with the steady composure of a man who knew how to manage his expectations. Being a single father had taught him to measure everything: his time, his energy, his trust. And the lingering racial undertones of the town had shaped his quiet restraint even further. The blind date had not been his idea. A co-worker insisted he deserved a night to himself, a chance to remember that he was more than a parent pushing through routines and navigating the subtle biases of a community that never fully embraced him. Still, as he sat near the window with a clear view of the parking lot, he felt the same cautious distance he carried into most new interactions. The diner buzzed with familiar faces, each person carefully balancing friendliness with unspoken judgment. Caleb had grown used to the way conversations paused when someone unfamiliar walked in, or the way glances lingered slightly longer on people who didn't fit the town's expectations. Even on a quiet afternoon, the undercurrent of selective hospitality remained. He had learned to live with it, but he never stopped noticing it. When a rusted sedan rolled into the parking lot, he glanced up without much thought until the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out, and the sight of her startled him more than he expected. Marisol Trent stood in the cold afternoon light, completely coated in drying mud, from her shoes to the sleeves of her torn jacket. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, and her steps were slow, as though each one carried the weight of an unseen burden. She looked out of place, worn down and deeply exhausted, the sort of exhaustion that came from more than a long drive or a minor accident. The reaction from inside the diner was immediate. Conversation softened. Forks paused mid-air. People turned their heads with the kind of careful disapproval that came wrapped in polite expressions. A few exchanged whispers, assuming quietly and confidently that they knew exactly what kind of trouble a woman like her represented. It was not just the mud. It was the race, the clothes, the unfamiliarity, the discomfort she triggered simply by existing in a space they believed belonged to them. Caleb watched her approach the diner door, and rather than judgment, he felt an unexpected tug of empathy. There was something in her uneven breathing and the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the handle that told him she had not simply walked through mud. She had endured something she wasn't ready to name. Her posture carried the rigid stiffness of someone bracing for impact, someone who stepped into rooms expecting to be questioned, doubted, or dismissed. As Marisol entered, she kept her gaze low, her shoulders tight. The drying mud along her sleeves cracked with every small movement, leaving flecks on the diner floor. She looked around briefly, just long enough for Caleb to notice the fear behind her exhaustion. This wasn't embarrassment. It was the quiet panic of someone who had been pushed to the edges of safety more than once. Her presence held the echo of unspoken stories shaped by environments where women of color, especially those without social standing, were often seen as problems rather than people. Caleb felt a shift inside himself, something steady and instinctive. He knew that look. He had worn it in his own ways, when assumptions overshadowed truth, when silence was easier than fighting to be understood. He sensed that Marisol was carrying wounds that weren't visible on her skin, the kind formed through repeated experiences of being dismissed or misjudged. And even though he didn't know her story yet, he could feel the depth of it. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that exchange, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of recognition, a fragile thread woven from shared understanding of struggle and survival. He gestured gently for her to join him, offering the kind of acceptance he wished the world had offered him more often. As Marisol stepped closer to the table, her jacket shifted slightly, and Caleb saw a glimpse of something unsettling beneath the layers of mud. A fresh hospital wristband wrapped tightly around her wrist. The diner's reaction to Marisol's presence grew sharper as she stood beside the table, her mud-caked clothes drawing even more unwanted attention. Conversations that had briefly resumed slowed again, and the glances drifting her way spoke louder than words ever could. People looked from the dirt smeared across her jacket to Caleb's mixed-race features, as if calculating how the two could possibly belong in the same space. Their expressions held quiet disapproval, the kind molded over years of unexamined prejudice, subtle enough to avoid confrontation, yet strong enough to sting. Caleb felt a familiar heaviness settle inside him, the same weight he had carried since childhood, in this very town. He recognized the judgment in their eyes because he had grown up beneath it. But what he felt even more strongly was the emotional pressure bearing down on Marisol, who held herself as if waiting for someone to call her out or push her away. The tension in her posture made it clear that her fear had nothing to do with embarrassment. It was the fear of someone who had been told again and again that she did not belong, not just in rooms like this, but in the lives of people who believed appearances defined worth. Caleb sensed the urgency in her breathing, the slight tremor in her hands, and the way she kept her elbows tucked close to her ribs, as though protecting herself from a memory too fresh to name. He understood the feeling of being watched for the wrong reasons, of being a moment from dismissal or blame, simply for existing out of place. It was a silent language he had learned far too well. To ease the pressure building around her, Caleb gently suggested stepping outside. His tone remained steady, neither questioning nor demanding, simply offering space. Marisol hesitated only for a brief moment before nodding, her shoulders tightening as she crossed the diner. She moved with the guarded steps of someone expecting resistance. The door finally swung shut behind them, separating them from the claustrophobic judgment inside. The crisp winter air met them like a quiet reprieve, free from the scrutiny that lingered inside the diner's walls. Still, Marisol's eyes scanned the street with caution, as if anticipating a figure she feared might appear at any moment. Her tension did not ease. It shifted into something deeper, something that suggested she had been running from more than humiliation. Caleb watched her with the patience of someone who knew not to rush fragile moments. The way her breath caught, the stiffness in her posture, and the protective angle of her arms all hinted at a recent encounter that left her feeling unsafe. It wasn't hard to imagine what kind of environment she might have come from, or what kind of treatment she might have received there. The trauma behind her silence felt layered, familiar, and far heavier than a ruined outfit. Caleb kept his voice gentle and his movements unhurried, giving her the kind of quiet reassurance most people never offered him when he needed it. It was a gesture of healing more than comfort, a small reminder that not everyone approached others with judgment at the forefront of their minds. As Marisol shifted her weight, flakes of dried mud cracked off her shoes and scattered across the pavement, revealing the thick buildup she must have walked through. It was not the kind of mud picked up by accident. It was dense, dark, and clung stubbornly to the soles, the kind found near deep riverbank soil. Caleb noted this silently, understanding that something more than a simple mishap had led her here in this condition. She lifted a hand to wipe her face, and the movement pulled her jacket sleeve back just enough for Caleb to see the hospital wristband more clearly. But it wasn't the hospital band that caught his breath. It was the second band beneath it. The thin white strip wrapped closely around her wrist wasn't medical. It was the kind issued when someone filed a police report, a band that marked both a statement and a moment of official distress. The sight of it shifted the entire emotional tone between them. Marisol wasn't merely distressed or anxious. She had been through something significant, something only hours old, judging by the faint sheen still clinging to the surface of the band. Caleb's understanding deepened as he examined the timestamp printed carefully across the plastic. It was recent, alarmingly recent, recorded only hours before she walked into the diner. Caleb led Marisol toward a quiet corner of the small park across from the diner, choosing a bench partly sheltered by bare winter branches. It offered distance from the watchful eyes they had just escaped, and enough open space to keep the moment from feeling confined. The cold air moved softly around them as she lowered herself carefully, the motion causing dried mud along her sleeves to crack and crumble. Every small sound she made seemed to reveal a layer of her recent ordeal, and Caleb felt an instinctive pull to understand what she had been through before walking into that diner. From the moment she sat, it was clear that she was attempting to hide more than dirt and exhaustion. The two wristbands circling her arm told a story she hadn't yet spoken aloud. The upper one, the medical band, identified her hospital visit and hinted at a brief stay. The second, thinner band, the police report band, offered a weightier truth. She had filed something official. something urgent enough to require documentation before the blind date ever took place. This knowledge created a quiet hush between them, as though the air itself recognized the significance of what she carried. Caleb's eyes traced the small details she tried to conceal. The faint abrasions along her forearms looked like marks from brambles or rough branches. A subtle discoloration near her neck suggested she had been outdoors far longer than she should have been in cold weather. The medical band's small printed notes mentioned mild hypothermia and surface-level bruising, details she kept hidden beneath her posture, hiding the wristbands beneath overlapping sleeves, folding her arms as if trying to protect herself from scrutiny. It wasn't the injuries alone that unsettled Caleb. It was the hesitation in her movements, the way she shifted slightly, as though carrying memories heavier than anything visible. Her silence was not empty. It was layered, full, carrying the exhaustion of someone who had already tried to explain herself to people unwilling to listen. She didn't avoid his eyes because she was ashamed. She avoided them because she had learned the cost of attempting to be believed in places where bias overshadowed truth. Caleb recognized that silence, the kind that accumulates over years of being spoken over, doubted, or categorized before being understood. It formed a bridge between them, a wordless link forged by shared experiences of being unheard. He noticed more as the minutes passed. The hem of her jacket had strands of riverweed stuck deep into the stitching, the kind that cling when someone pushes through wet underbrush. Torn fibers along her sleeve suggested fabric catching on branches. The mud on her shoes was layered thick, not from a simple misstep, but from trudging through terrain that resisted every movement. These observations sketched the outline of what had happened, enough for Caleb to sense that she had fled from something rather than stumbled into it. Little by little, as the cold air settled around them, Marisol's breathing began to soften. She still looked wary, but the rigid defensiveness in her posture eased as Caleb allowed space for her to simply exist without interrogation. It was a subtle shift, a small but meaningful step toward emotional grounding. For someone who had been treated as an inconvenience rather than a person in need, the simple act of being allowed to breathe without judgment was its own form of relief. When Caleb finally looked down at her wrist again, his gaze caught on the printed details beneath the police report band. The involved party section listed a name he knew, a name connected to stories most people in town pretended weren't true. It was a name whispered in caution, a name tied to influence and intimidation. The moment he registered it, something inside him tightened. He understood instantly why her fear ran so deep and why she had arrived in such a state. And the realization carried the weight of everything he had always known about the darker realities of the town. The name printed on that wristband belonged to someone the town protected at all costs. Caleb felt a quiet chill settle over him as he read the name printed beneath the plastic of the police report band, Darren Kessler. The weight of that name was enough to make sense of the fear woven through Marisol's posture. It was a name that drifted through the town like a warning, always whispered, never spoken loudly enough to reach accountability. Darren came from a family whose influence stretched through local government, law enforcement, and even community spaces that prided themselves on fairness. But fairness was rarely offered evenly, and people like Caleb had long learned how quickly justice shifted depending on who stood on either side of it. Darren had a reputation, one built not on official records, but on stories quietly shared by those who had felt unsafe in his presence. Confrontations that never made it to paper, complaints that vanished, fear that accumulated silently because speaking aloud risked more trouble than staying quiet. As Caleb looked at Marisol, her past few hours began forming a clearer picture. The scratches along her arms, the torn threads of her jacket, the mud layered so deeply into her clothes. It no longer seemed like the result of an accidental slide or misstep. These signs felt like the remnants of someone trying to escape a situation where they were not meant to walk away unafraid. The realization that she had crossed paths with Darren tightened something inside Caleb, a familiar coil of frustration and protectiveness he had felt countless times while witnessing how the town selectively enforced safety. Marisol watched Caleb closely, sensing his awareness. Her shoulders shifted slightly, as though the recognition he offered lifted some of the burden she carried. For the first time since he met her, her gaze didn't dart away the moment he tried to read her expression. Instead, she held it just long enough for him to see the depth of her exhaustion and the quiet relief of finally standing before someone who didn't question her reality. She didn't need to explain much. The shared understanding of how bias operated in this town spoke louder than any detailed recounting. Her breath steadied with the smallest degree of comfort, the beginnings of emotional healing slipping into the cold air between them. The moment, however, was interrupted by the slow crawl of a police cruiser passing along the road that bordered the park. The car moved at an unhurried pace, as if the officer inside wanted to be sure they were seen. The uniformed figure behind the wheel gave Marisol a glance that communicated everything without words. It was the look of someone who had already made up his mind, the look of dismissal she had likely endured only hours earlier. Caleb recognized it instantly. It was the same look he had received many times in his life, a look that treated fear as exaggeration and truth as inconvenience. The cruiser continued past them, but the message lingered, adding tension to the air. Caleb shifted slightly closer to Marisol, not invading her space, but making it clear that she wasn't standing alone. His protective instincts rose quietly, shaped by years of navigating spaces where his safety depended on reading subtle cues. He didn't speak, but Marisol sensed the shift in him. She adjusted her posture again, her shoulders no longer curled inward as tightly. A fragile trust had begun taking root, fed by the realization that someone was willing to stand beside her without asking her to prove her fear. As she pushed her hair back from her face, her jacket slipped off her shoulder for a brief moment. Caleb's breath caught when he noticed the faint outline of a bruise beneath the mud, the shape unmistakably formed by fingers pressing too tightly into skin. It wasn't angrily inflicted or violently dramatic, but it was clear, precise, and intentional enough to tell him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a fall. This wasn't clumsiness or accident. Someone had grabbed her. Caleb led Marisol farther into the lakeside park, choosing a spot where the open space and quiet surroundings might help ease the tightness in her breathing. The lake stretched out calmly before them, its surface reflecting the pale winter sky, creating a sense of stillness the diner could never offer. He slowed his steps so she wouldn't feel rushed, allowing her time to absorb the shift from tension to something gentler. She moved with caution, every step revealing how much her body remained braced for danger. When they reached an old picnic bench facing the water, she lowered herself onto the edge of it, the wooden slats creaking lightly beneath her weight. Though her shoulders remained stiff, there was a slight release in her posture that suggested her guard had dropped, just enough to let in a breath of relief. Up close, the details of her clothing painted a clearer picture of the night she had endured. Threads hung loose where her jacket had caught on something sharp. Bits of dried foliage clung to the seams, as if she had pushed through brush in a hurry. A damp, earthy smell lingered around her, a reminder of river mud that had not yet fully dried. These elements told a story long before she ever spoke a word, each marking a moment of hurried movement or forced escape. Caleb noticed the subtle shiver that ran through her as a breeze drifted by, and it wasn't just from the cold. It carried the echo of a fear she had not yet released. Caleb sat a short distance away, positioned so she could look at him or away from him without feeling cornered. He offered no immediate question. Instead, he allowed silence to settle between them, the kind of silence that didn't demand explanation, but instead offered space. His restraint was intentional. He understood all too well how dangerous it could be to pressure someone into recounting a moment of trauma, especially when that trauma had already been dismissed by those meant to protect her. He let the rhythm of the moment unfold naturally, giving her the room she needed to begin the slow work of gathering her strength. That patience became a quiet turning point. Marisol's breaths eased, no longer sharp and shallow. Her hands, initially clasped tightly in her lap, began to loosen. She reached up at one point, touching her shoulder where he had earlier noticed the bruise, and the gesture was filled with unspoken memories that flickered across her expression. She wasn't ready to speak them aloud, but she was allowing herself to feel them, which was its own form of healing. Her gaze, once fixed on the ground, lifted now and then toward the lake, as though the steady water offered a kind of stability she could lean on. Caleb watched her carefully, noticing each small shift in her demeanor. He recognized these movements, subtle signs of a trauma response, because he had encountered them in others and lived through versions of them himself. The process of reclaiming emotional balance often started in these faint gestures, unclenching hands, slower breathing, the courage to lift one's eyes. It was a delicate transformation, and he treated it with a kind of respect born from understanding how precious and fragile it could be. After several minutes of quiet, Marisol's voice finally broke through the soft sound of the wind skimming across the lake. It wasn't full or steady, but it carried enough certainty to reveal that she had reached a point where holding everything inside was no longer an option. She didn't immediately dive into details. Instead, she hinted at the weight of something she had witnessed, something that had shaken her deeply and made her realize she could not face it alone. She confessed, in her hesitant way, that the reason she agreed to the blind date was not simply the hope of companionship, but the belief, rooted in instinct, that Caleb might be the only person in town who would not dismiss her the moment she tried to speak the truth. Her admission carried a vulnerability that settled heavily between them. Caleb felt the significance of the trust she placed in him, knowing she had very little left to lean on after being pushed away by those expected to protect her. He nodded gently, affirming without words that she had chosen correctly. Marisol took a slow breath and shifted her body slightly toward him, gathering the last pieces of courage she needed. The tension in her eyes deepened, not from fear of him, but from the memory she was preparing to confront again. She looked toward the lake one more time, steadying herself for what she had to share. And then, with a quiet resolve, she prepared to reveal what she had seen on the river road the night before. Marisol sat quietly for several moments before she finally began to speak, her voice carrying a tremor that revealed how deeply the memory unsettled her. She described driving along the old industrial river road the night before, a stretch of land she chose only because she believed it would be empty at that hour. The road ran parallel to the river, bordered by uneven ground and trees that formed a shadowy corridor. She had taken it to clear her mind after a difficult day, hoping the quiet drive would ease the tension she felt. But instead of peace, she found herself drawn into a moment that reshaped everything. As she rounded a bend, her headlights swept across two figures standing near the riverbank. The ground there was soft from recent rain, and the mud clung thickly to their shoes. She immediately sensed tension between them, not the kind sparked by a simple disagreement, but the kind born from years of imbalance, the kind that reflected the complex, unspoken lines of race and power that shaped the town. Even from her car, she recognized the imbalance in their stance. One man was Darren Kessler, unmistakable even in the dim light. The other man, a stranger she had never seen before, looked frightened. His posture was cautious, his movements small, as though he was trying to distance himself without provoking Darren further. The moment lingered in Marisol's mind. As she spoke, her memory sharpening around the fearful stillness of the stranger and the rigid confidence in Darren's stance. She didn't hear everything they said, but the energy between them was unmistakable. It was the quiet, suffocating tension of someone who knew he had little protection against someone who held all the social leverage. Darren's posture shifted as he spoke, leaning forward slightly, arms set at sharp angles that suggested dominance. The stranger, caught in the uneven ground, seemed to struggle for footing, not because he was threatened physically, but because he was trapped in a space where his voice held little weight. When Darren turned toward Marisol's approaching car, everything inside her tightened. His expression, illuminated briefly by her headlights, shifted from irritation to something far more unsettling. It wasn't anger alone. It was recognition. It was the look of a man who had been witnessed in a moment he never expected anyone else to see. Marisol's instinct told her immediately that she did not want to be noticed, and certainly not by him. She tried to reverse her car quickly, but the road's soft shoulder had been softened by days of damp weather. The wheels sank into the thick river mud before she could pull away. The car lurched in place, tires spinning helplessly. Panic set in as she realized she couldn't simply drive out. She turned off the engine and scrambled toward the passenger side, knowing she had to abandon the vehicle to avoid being confronted. She pushed the door open with difficulty and climbed out, slipping on the mud as she tried to gain her footing. In her hurry, she stumbled forward and grabbed onto underbrush, scraping her arms on low branches as she pulled herself up the slope that led toward the tree line. Once she reached the cover of the trees, she crouched low and tried to steady her breathing. The night was cold, and the damp air clung to her skin as she hid among the branches. She heard faint echoes, voices carried by the river's steady flow, but the words were blurred. Her hands trembled as she fought the urge to move, knowing any sound might draw attention. She stayed hidden until headlights appeared from another vehicle on the distant road. A driver eventually slowed down after spotting her near the tree line and offered help, taking her to the hospital where she received basic care and attempted to report what she witnessed. But when she explained everything, the officer barely listened. He nodded in a way that implied patience, not belief. He suggested she might have misunderstood the situation, or perhaps misinterpreted the tension she sensed. Marisol described how every attempt to clarify only made him lean further into polite dismissal. By the time she left, she felt smaller than when she had arrived, carrying the sinking realization that the truth she tried to share would not be acknowledged. As Marisol finished recounting her memory, Caleb remained completely still, listening with the full weight of understanding she had been denied earlier. His quiet validation gave her a sense of grounding she hadn't felt since the previous night. And then, with a hesitant breath, Marisol reached into her mud-stained bag, preparing to reveal something she had grabbed during her escape. Marisol opened her bag with the hesitance of someone uncertain whether revealing its contents would bring clarity or deeper trouble. Her fingers shook slightly as she reached inside, and when she finally pulled the object free, Caleb understood why she had carried such a heavy silence until now. Resting in her palm was a cracked cell phone, its casing scraped and dented as though it had skidded across stone before landing in the mud. Even without turning it on, the device felt significant. Too damaged to belong to someone who had lost it casually, too out of place to be hers. The realization that this must be Darren's phone settled between them like a sudden gust of cold air. She explained softly that she didn't remember grabbing it in the chaos. She had been scrambling up the muddy bank, desperate to escape, and must have instinctively held on to anything within reach as she fought through the darkness. It wasn't until she reached the hospital, hands still trembling, that she noticed the unfamiliar weight pressing against the lining of her bag. Shock and fear had kept her from examining it then, and the officer's dismissive attitude made her even more uncertain about mentioning it. Carrying it with her to the blind date had not been intentional. It was simply something she wasn't ready to let go of because she sensed it mattered, even if she didn't fully understand how. Caleb took the phone gently, turning it over with care. The screen was spider-webbed with cracks, but the power button still worked. When the display flickered to life, patches of distorted pixels danced across it, revealing just enough for them to see that the last opened file was a video. He tapped it cautiously. The recording started mid-motion, blurry and unfocused, as though the phone had begun filming unintentionally during the confrontation. Bits of audio broke through in fragments, voices raised with tension, footsteps sinking into soft ground, a plea that carried fear even through the distortion. As the phone continued to struggle through the damaged footage, a clearer moment emerged. Darren stepped into view, partially illuminated by the faint glow of distant headlights. His posture was unmistakable, rigid, looming, and assertive. The other man, the one Marisol had described earlier, appeared visibly unsettled, his stance shifting as though trying not to provoke further escalation. The physical distance between them was small, but the imbalance was vast. Even through the crackling audio, the tone of the encounter revealed discomfort, hostility, and a sharp undercurrent of racial aggression that left no room for misinterpretation. Caleb felt a tightness form in his chest as he watched. The evidence before him validated everything Marisol had tried to explain, everything the officer had so casually dismissed. It proved she had witnessed something serious, something that deserved attention, not dismissal. A sense of relief washed over him on her behalf, the kind of relief that comes when truth finally gains a platform after being silenced. Yet alongside that relief rose a heavy sense of dread. Evidence this strong could expose the truth, but in a town where connections shielded the powerful, it could also invite retaliation or attempts to bury what they had found. Marisol watched him closely, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and hope. The act of showing him the phone alone revealed the strength she had carried through the ordeal. Despite the trauma, despite the disbelief she had faced earlier, she had somehow held on to the one thing that could shift the narrative from speculation to undeniable fact. Her courage in preserving it spoke volumes about her instinct to survive and protect not only herself but also the truth. Caleb felt an unspoken bond forming between them, a quiet solidarity rooted in shared understanding of how quickly stories like this were ignored when told by people who weren't granted the benefit of belief. The moment became one of emotional reaffirmation, Marisol beginning to trust that her truth mattered, and Caleb recognizing the responsibility now placed in his hands. As he exhaled slowly, trying to process the weight of the evidence, his phone vibrating in his pocket abruptly cut through the moment. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and froze. An incoming call appeared from a number marked as private, yet he recognized the urgency behind it. It was the officer who had dismissed Marisol's report earlier. The vibration of Caleb's phone seemed louder than it should have been, cutting sharply into the fragile calm that had formed between him and Marisol. He glanced down and saw the blocked number again, and a quiet certainty settled in his chest. This call wasn't meant to help them. It was meant to deter, to warn, to remind them of where the town's loyalties truly lay. The officer who had dismissed her report earlier wasn't calling out of concern. He was calling because he knew more than he should. Caleb didn't answer. He let the phone buzz in his hand, his silence an unspoken refusal to engage in whatever pressure was waiting on the other end. Marisol watched him with an expression that mirrored his fear, but also something steadier, recognition. She too understood the implication behind the call. She had grown familiar with the unspoken language of being doubted, of being brushed aside in subtle ways that carried the weight of deeper intention. Now, seeing Caleb refuse to be intimidated brought a shift inside her, something she hadn't felt since the night began. It wasn't confidence exactly, but it was close. It was the sense that she wasn't alone in facing this. They both knew the evidence couldn't remain in town. The phone he held wasn't just proof of wrongdoing. It was a threat to those who wanted the narrative to remain untouched. Caleb's mind moved quickly, recalling the name of a civil rights investigator he had heard about, from a friend in another city. Someone whose work focused on cases like this, someone who had no ties to the people who maintained the town's fragile sense of order. He suggested reaching out to this investigator, explaining that it might be the only way to ensure the truth didn't disappear. Marisol nodded, her posture straightening in a way that showed how much this plan meant to her. The decision wasn't without risk, but it was the first step toward reclaiming the voice she had been denied. As they rose from the bench, the emotional arc between them shifted into something stronger. They weren't just two strangers thrown together by circumstance anymore. Their connection had grown out of shared understanding. Pain recognized, truth validated, fear confronted side by side. Caleb could feel the weight of responsibility settling on him, not as a burden, but as a choice he was ready to make. Marisol walked beside him, her steps more certain than before. She no longer carried the same fragile tension that clung to her earlier. She walked as someone who had regained a piece of herself by finally being believed. The path leading back toward the parking lot was quiet, but something subtle in the air had changed. A heaviness hung over the space, as though the world itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. Caleb's grip tightened slightly around the damaged cell phone as they approached his truck. He unlocked it with a sense of urgency, scanning the surroundings without making it obvious. Marisol looked around too, her instincts sharpened by the events of the night before. She stepped closer to Caleb, not out of fear, but because she understood that they had reached a point where standing apart would be dangerous. Just as Caleb reached for the driver's side door, the sharp crunch of tires turning in gravel broke through the quiet. They both turned. A second police cruiser had pulled into the lot, cutting an angular line across the exit. The headlights cast long shadows, and the engine continued to idle with a low, deliberate rumble. The officer inside stepped out with a calmness that felt too controlled, too intentional. His expression carried a politeness that didn't reach his eyes. A facade Caleb had seen countless times in this town, professional on the surface, strategic underneath. The officer took slow steps toward them, his posture calculated, his presence unmistakably authoritative. He didn't call out, didn't ask if they needed assistance. He simply stopped a short distance away, watching them with a look that made their purpose painfully clear. Caleb and Marisol exchanged a glance that held the weight of everything they had learned that day. The biases, the dismissal, the truth no one wanted exposed. It didn't require a single word to understand exactly why the officer had arrived. He wasn't there to question them. He was there to stop them from leaving. If stories like this moved you, stay with our channel. Every voice we highlight deserves to be heard. Your support helps us bring forward the truths many communities still silence. Share this journey with someone who understands the weight of being unseen, and stay connected for more real stories that matter. Before you go, tell me this. If you were in Caleb's place and saw someone the whole town ignored, would you still choose to believe them, knowing the risk?